Marcus Chun had been sleeping in his pickup truck for 3 weeks when he heard about the auction that would change his life forever. With $73 to his name and nowhere left to run, he never imagined that 5 crumpled dollar bills would buy him more than he'd ever bargained for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn morning bit sharp and cold as Marcus pulled his battered Ford into the gravel lot outside the Millbrook County Courthouse. His breath clouded the windshield as he counted his money for the 4th time that hour. $73. After gas, maybe 60 left. Enough for a few more nights in a motel if he stretched it, but not enough to start over. Not enough to matter. He'd driven 18 hours straight from Denver, chasing a rumor he'd overheard at a truck stop. Government. Land auction. Properties going for pennies on the dollar. Desperate times, desperate measures. Marcus had run out of both pride and options 3 states ago. The courthouse steps were already crowded with serious-looking men in pressed shirts and cowboy hats, clutching folders thick with paperwork. Real buyers. Marcus felt his stomach clench. These weren't desperate drifters like him. These were ranchers and developers with actual money, actual plans. He almost turned around right then, but his truck was making a grinding noise that spelled expensive trouble, and his last job had ended when the construction company folded overnight, taking his final paycheck with it. At 34, Marcus Chun had learned that sometimes the only choice left was between bad and worse. Inside the courthouse, the air smelled of old wood and nervous sweat. The auctioneer, a thin man with steel-rimmed glasses, shuffled through his papers while buyers settled into metal folding chairs. Marcus found a spot in the back, close to the exit, trying to make himself invisible among the sea of weathered faces and confident postures. The first few properties went exactly as expected. A small plot of farmland went for $12,000. A commercial lot in town center hit $28,000 before the hammer fell. Marcus watched the numbers climb far beyond his reach, wondering why he'd bothered to come. This wasn't for people like him. This was for people who belonged somewhere. Then the auctioneer's voice shifted, taking on a different tone. Next item, Lot 47. The old Whitmore Ranch, 340 acres in the eastern county. Now folks, I'm obligated to mention that this property comes with certain complications. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Marcus noticed several serious bidders exchange glances and lean back in their chairs. The property has been in foreclosure for 6 months, the auctioneer continued, his voice carefully neutral. Previous attempts to clear the land have been unsuccessful. Local authorities have cited various challenges with the existing occupancy situation. Bidding starts at $50. Silence. The kind of heavy silence that met everyone in the room knew something Marcus didn't. He watched as men who'd been eagerly raising their hands for every other lot suddenly found their shoes very interesting. $50, the auctioneer repeated, his voice slightly higher now. Do I have 50? More silence. A few men whispered to each other, shaking their heads. In the third row, someone actually chuckled, low and knowing. $25? The auctioneer's confidence was beginning to crack. This is 340 acres of good grazing land, folks. 25? Marcus felt something stir in his chest. Something that might have been hope or might have been stupidity. 340 acres. He'd never owned so much as a parking space in his life. Had never owned anything that couldn't fit in the back of his truck. $10? The auctioneer was practically pleading now. Surely someone can see the potential in this fine property. The chuckling was spreading. Marcus heard fragments of whispered conversation. Double quotes ... now. OULDN. Single quotes T touch that place with a 10-foot pole ... Heard the bank sent 3 different crews. Double quotes ... curse ain't worth any amount of land ... Curse. The word. hit Marcus like a physical thing. He'd grown up hearing his grandmother's stories about cursed places and bad luck that followed families for generations. But he'd also grown up poor enough to know that sometimes other people's superstitions created opportunities for those desperate enough to take them. $5, the auctioneer said finally, his voice thin with embarrassment. Opening bid. $5 for the Whitmore Ranch. Marcus felt his hand rising before his brain caught up with the movement. His voice came out hoarse and uncertain. $5. The room went dead quiet. Every head turned to stare at him. Marcus felt heat creep up his neck as dozens of eyes assessed him, most with expressions ranging from pity to amusement. In the front row, an older man with a silver mustache shook his head slowly, like he was watching someone walk off a cliff. "We have $5, the auctioneer said, relief and disbelief warring in his voice. "Do I hear 10? The silence stretched, so long that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. No one moved, no one spoke. Finally, the auctioneer raised his gavel, going once for $5. A pause. Going twice. Another pause, longer this time. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $5. The gavel fell with a sound like a gunshot. Marcus sat frozen as conversations resumed around him, feeling like he'd just stepped through a door he couldn't see and wouldn't be able to find again. 340 acres. For $5, there had to be a catch. There was always a catch. The paperwork took less than an hour. Marcus found himself signing document after document, his hand shaking slightly as he wrote his name on deed transfers and tax forms. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, kept glancing at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You sure about this, honey?" she asked quietly as he signed the final page. "That property's got, well, it's got some history." "What kind of history?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. She hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. The Whitmore family owned that land for 4 generations. Good people mostly, but the last few years. She shook her head. Old William Whitmore lost his son in Afghanistan, then his wife to cancer. Couldn't keep up with the mortgage after that. Bank tried to foreclose 3 times, but ... But what? Well, there's still folks living there. Whitmore's daughter-in-law and her children, Clara Whitmore, lost her husband same time as William lost his son. Bank's been trying to get them out for months, but Clara ... She's got nowhere to go. 6 little ones to care for, and no family left. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. 6 kids, youngest is barely 2, oldest maybe 14. Sweet children, all of them. But Clara's been fighting the eviction like a wildcat. 3 different crews have tried to clear the property for the bank. None of them lasted more than a day. Why not? The clerk's voice dropped even lower. Strange things happen out there. Equipment breaks down for no reason. Workers get hurt in freak accidents. Tools go missing. Last crew swore they heard voices in the walls, doors slamming when no one was around. Folks started saying the place is cursed, that the Whitmore ghosts don't want strangers on their land. Marcus stared at the deed in his hands, his name stark and official on the aged paper. He owned a cursed ranch with a family of 7 people living on it illegally. People with nowhere else to go. "Children, I have to ask," he said finally. "What am I supposed to do? Legally, I mean." The clerk's expression softened further. "Legally, you could call the sheriff, have them removed. It's your property now, but..." She paused, studying his face. "You don't look like the type to put children on the street." She was right. Marcus had spent his own childhood bouncing between foster homes and relatives who didn't want him. He knew what it felt like to have nowhere to belong, nowhere safe to land. The idea of forcing a family from their home, especially children, made his chest tight with familiar pain, but he also knew he couldn't afford to be noble. He had $68 left and a truck that might not make it another 100 miles. He'd bought the ranch as a desperate gamble, hoping for land he could maybe sell or trade for something smaller, something manageable. He hadn't counted on inheriting a family. Outside the courthouse, the autumn sun felt thin and cold. Marcus sat in his truck, staring at the deed and trying to figure out what he'd just done. The smart thing would be to drive back to town, find a phone, and call the sheriff. Get the property cleared so he could figure out what to do with it. But as he started the engine, his grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes the hardest path is the only one that leads where you need to go, Marcus. And sometimes what looks like bad luck is just good luck wearing work clothes. He pulled out of the courthouse parking lot and turned east, toward the Whitmore Ranch, toward 340 acres of cursed land and a family with nowhere to run. Toward the biggest gamble of a life that had been nothing but gambles from the start. The county road stretched empty and straight ahead of him, bordered by fence posts and autumn grass that bent in the wind like waves. Marcus drove toward his uncertain future, carrying nothing but hope, desperation, and the deed to a place that everyone else had been too afraid to claim. He had no idea that in 20 minutes, he'd be standing face to face with Clara Whitmore and her 6 children, or that the conversation waiting for him would change everything he thought he knew about family, belonging, and what it meant to finally have a place to call home. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The gravel road to the Whitmore Ranch wound through stands of cottonwood trees whose leaves had turned the color of old gold. Marcus drove slowly, partly because his truck's suspension couldn't handle the potholes, but mostly because each mile brought him closer to a conversation he had no idea how to start. What did you say to a woman whose home you just bought out from under her? What did you say to children who were about to lose the only security they'd ever known? The ranch gate hung open, one hinge broken so it sagged toward the ground like a wounded bird. A weathered sign still bore the name Whitmore Ranch in faded blue letters, though someone had tried to paint over foreclosure notices that had been nailed to the post. The attempts to cover the legal warnings only made them more obvious, like scars that refused to heal properly. Marcus pulled through the gate and got his first look at what $5 had bought him. The main house sat about a quarter mile from the road, a 2-story farmhouse that had once been white, but now showed more gray than paint. The wraparound porch sagged in places, and several windows were covered with plywood or plastic sheeting. But there were signs of life everywhere. Children's toys scattered in the yard, laundry hanging on a line strung between 2 oak trees. Smoke rising from the chimney dot as his truck crunched across the gravel drive. Marcus saw movement at the windows. Faces appeared and disappeared quickly, like cautious wildlife. A tire swing hung from the old oak tree, still swaying slightly as if someone had just jumped off. This wasn't an abandoned property. This was a home, lived in and loved despite its obvious struggles. He parked near the front steps and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. The smart play would be to stay in the truck, honk the horn, and conduct this business from a safe distance. But Marcus had learned long ago that hard conversations were like pulling off bandages, better done quick and direct than drawn out in small, painful pieces. The front door opened before he reached the porch steps. The woman who emerged could have been anywhere from 28 to 40, the kind of worn-down tiredness that made age irrelevant. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her jeans were patched at both knees. But her green eyes were fierce and alert, the eyes of someone who'd been fighting battles for so long that wariness had become a permanent expression. "You're trespassing," she said without preamble. Her voice carried the flat authority of someone who'd had this conversation before. "Don't care what papers you think you've got. This is private property." "Clara Whitmore?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Depends on who's asking. Her hand rested on the porch railing, but Marcus noticed how she positioned herself between him and the front door, protecting whatever was behind her. My name's Marcus Chun. I just came from the courthouse auction. I bought this property. He pulled the deed from his jacket pocket, the official papers rustling in the cold air. Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't seem surprised. Another vulture come to pick the bones. Well, you can turn right around and head back where you came from. We've been through this dance before. This is different, Marcus said, though he wasn't entirely sure how yet. Different how? You some kind of saint? Going to let us stay out of the goodness of your heart? The bitterness in her voice could have cut glass. I've heard every story, mister. Just need to assess the property. Give us a few days to process the paperwork. We'll work something out. They all end the same way, with my children watching strangers load our life into boxes. Behind Clara, Marcus caught glimpses of movement through the screen door. Small faces pressed against the mesh, eyes wide with the kind of attention children paid when they sensed adult tension. He counted at least 4 different heights, ranging from barely tall enough to see over the windowsill to nearly Clara's shoulder. How long have you been fighting this? He asked. Clara's laugh held no humor. 6 months of legal notices. 4 months of actual foreclosure proceedings. 3 crews of men who came to clear the property for the bank. She studied his face, looking for something. Funny thing about those crews, though, they never seemed to last very long. I heard about that. Equipment problems? Equipment problems, freak accidents, tools walking off by themselves. Amazing how clumsy grown men can get when they're trying to tear down someone's home. There was something in her tone that wasn't quite innocent. Course, I wouldn't know anything about that. I'm just a widow trying to keep a roof over her children's heads. A crash came from inside the house, followed by a child's voice calling, "Sorry, Mama." Clara's fierce expression flickered for just a moment, revealing something softer underneath. Look, Mr. Chun, was it? I don't know what you paid for this place, but you got cheated. This ranch is more trouble than it's worth. Ask anyone in town. Ask the bank. Ask those crews who came out here with their fancy equipment and left with their tails between their legs. Actually, Marcus said, I paid $5. That stopped her cold. For the first time since he'd arrived, Clara Whitmore looked genuinely surprised. $5? $5, only bid at the auction. Nobody else wanted it. Clara stared at him for a long moment, then let out a sound that might have been laughter if it hadn't been so tired. Well, hell, you might be the first honest man to show up here in months. Most folks try to pretend they're doing us some kind of favor. The screen door creaked open, and a girl who looked about 14 stepped onto the porch. She had her mother's green eyes but lighter hair, and she moved with the careful responsibility of someone who'd grown up too fast. Behind her, Marcus could see smaller children crowding in the doorway. "Mama," the girl said quietly. "Is this another bank man?" "No, sweetheart. This is Mr. Chun. He says he bought our place at the auction today." The girl, Sarah, he'd learn later, looked him up and down with an assessment that would have made a loan officer proud. For how much? "Sarah," Clara warned. $5, Marcus said. The honesty felt strange after so many conversations built on half-truths and careful omissions. Now the girl looked genuinely confused. $5 for the whole ranch? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Marcus admitted. A smaller boy, maybe 8 or 9, pushed past Sarah to get a better look. "Are you here to make us leave?" he asked with the directness that only children possessed. Marcus looked down at the boy's serious face, at the way Sarah's hand protectively touched his shoulder, at Clara's defensive posture that couldn't quite hide her exhaustion. These weren't squatters or freeloaders. They were a family holding onto the last piece of stability they had left. "I don't know yet," he said, which was probably the most honest answer he'd given anyone in years. Tommy, get back inside, Clara said. You too, Sarah. Take the little ones to the kitchen. But Mama, now. The children retreated, but Marcus could see them pressed against the windows, watching. He understood the feeling. He'd spent his own childhood on the outside of adult conversations that would determine where he slept that night. So what's your story, Mr. Chun? Clara asked once they were alone again. You some kind of property developer? Planning to flip this place for a profit? Marcus almost laughed. With his worn-out clothes and battered truck, he probably looked about as far from a developer as possible. Not exactly. I've got $63 to my name and nowhere else to go. I was hoping this place might be ... I don't know. A fresh start, maybe. Clara studied his face again, and this time her expression shifted slightly. You're broke. Completely. Homeless? Been sleeping in my truck for 3 weeks. And you spent 5 of your last $68 on a cursed ranch with a family. Already living in it? Seemed like a good idea at the time. This time Clara's laugh was genuine, if still edged with disbelief. Mister, you might be the worst businessman I've ever met. Or the best gambler. Haven't decided which yet. A smaller child appeared at the screen door. A little girl with pigtails who couldn't have been more than 4. Mama is the nice man. Staying for dinner? Emma, go help Sarah with the babies, Clara said, but her voice was gentler now. We don't have much, she said to Marcus, but there's stew and cornbread. Been cooking all day for the little ones. She paused, seeming to wrestle with something. You look like you haven't had a hot meal in a while. Marcus felt something catch in his throat. He'd been offered charity before, but never by someone who clearly had less than he did. Never by someone he'd just inadvertently threatened to make homeless. I can't take food from your children, he said. Wasn't asking for permission, Clara replied. Was offering courtesy. There's a difference. She turned toward the door, then stopped. Fair warning, though. This place really is cursed. Not in the way most folks think, but cursed all the same. Bad luck follows the Whitmore name like a shadow. You might want to keep that in mind before you get too attached to the idea of staying. Marcus watched her disappear into the house, leaving him alone on the sagging porch with a deed that felt heavier than paper should, and the sound of children's voices drifting from inside. Through the window, he could see Clara moving around a small kitchen, Sarah helping to set the table, smaller children climbing onto chairs around a wooden table that had seen better decades. It looked like family. Like belonging, like everything. Marcus had spent his adult life watching from the outside. The smart thing would be to drive back to town, call the sheriff, and sort this out legally. But as the smell of home-cooked food drifted through the screen door, and he heard a baby laughing somewhere inside, Marcus realized he was already in deeper than $5 could measure. He was about to enter a house that everyone else was afraid to touch, to sit at a table with a family that wasn't his, on land that might or might not actually be cursed. And for the first time in 3 weeks of sleeping in his truck, he felt like he might be exactly where he needed to be. The Whitmore kitchen told the story of a family making do with what they had. The linoleum floor was cracked but scrubbed clean, and mismatched chairs surrounded a table that bore the rings and scratches of decades of family meals. Children's artwork covered the refrigerator, held in place with magnets advertising long-closed businesses. It should have felt cramped with 8 people around a table meant for 6, but instead it felt warm in a way Marcus had almost forgotten existed. Clara ladled beef stew into chipped ceramic bowls while Sarah helped the smaller children wash their hands at a sink that required a step stool for anyone under 10. Marcus found himself seated between Tommy, the 8-year-old who'd asked if he was there to make them leave, and a quiet boy of about 12 who'd been introduced as David, but hadn't spoken a word since Marcus entered the house. This is Emma, Clara said, nodding toward the pigtailed 4-year-old who kept stealing glances at Marcus between bites. And that's Michael. She indicated a sandy-haired boy of about 6 who was methodically arranging his vegetables in order of size before eating them. The babies are Lucy and Jake. Lucy appeared to be around 2, sitting in a makeshift high chair that looked like it had been crafted from a regular chair and some creative carpentry. Jake, barely walking age, sat on Clara's lap, occasionally grabbing for her spoon. The organized chaos of feeding 6 children while maintaining any semblance of adult conversation was something Marcus had never witnessed up close. "Mr. Chun's from Denver," Clara told the children, as if explaining why a stranger was suddenly at their dinner table. "That's really far," Emma said, her eyes wide. "Did you drive here in that truck?" "I did," Marcus said, accepting a bowl of stew from Sarah. The smell alone was enough to remind him he hadn't eaten anything substantial in 2 days. "Is it broken?" Tommy asked. "It sounds funny." "Tommy," Clara warned, but Marcus found himself smiling. "It is a little broken," he admitted. "Sometimes old trucks get tired, just like people do." "Papa used to fix trucks," Emma announced. "Mama says he could fix anything that had an engine." An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Sarah shot Emma a look that clearly meant, "We don't talk about that," but the damage was done. Marcus saw Clara's expression tighten, the careful walls going back up. "Papa's in heaven now," Emma continued, oblivious to the tension. "With Grandpa Will. Mama says they're watching over us." "Emma, eat your dinner," Clara said quietly. Marcus took a bite of the stew, which was surprisingly good, considering it had probably been made from whatever was available rather than what was wanted. The meat was tender, the vegetables perfectly cooked, and there was something about eating food prepared by someone else's hands that felt like a luxury he'd forgotten existed. "This is really good," he said, and meant it. "Mama's the best cook in the whole world," Michael piped up, speaking for the first time since Marcus had arrived. "Well, I don't know about the whole world," Clara said, but Marcus caught the small smile that flickered across her face. "She makes the best pancakes on Sundays," Tommy added. "And sometimes she makes cookies when we've been really good." "When's the last time we had cookies?" David asked, the first words Marcus had heard from the 12-year-old. "David," Sarah said sharply. "What? It's been forever." "Not since," he caught himself, glancing at his mother. "Not since we ran out of sugar," Clara finished calmly, though Marcus noticed the way her knuckles whitened around her spoon. The conversation moved to safer topics after that. School, which the older children attended in town when Clara could manage the gas for the drive. The animals they'd had to sell when money got tight. The vegetable garden that had kept them fed through the summer. Normal family talk, the kind Marcus had observed in other people's homes, but never been part of himself. As the meal progressed, he found himself watching the dynamics around the table. Sarah, clearly the deputy parent, cutting Emma's meat without being asked and making sure Michael didn't feed his vegetables to the dog that materialized hopefully beside his chair. David, quiet and watchful, eating steadily while keeping one eye on the adults' conversation. Tommy, full of questions and energy even while sitting still. The little ones, Emma chattering and Michael focused on his methodical eating style, both blissfully unaware of the adult tension swirling around them, and Clara, orchestrating it all while balancing a toddler on her lap and managing her own meal. Marcus had seemed tired before. Construction was brutal work that left men exhausted, but this was different. This was the bone-deep weariness of someone carrying responsibility for 7 lives with no backup, no safety net, and no end in sight. "So what's your plan, Mr. Chun?" Clara asked when the children had finished eating, and Sarah was helping the little ones get ready for baths. "For the ranch, I mean." Marcus set down his spoon, suddenly aware that his answer would determine everything. "That happened next. Honestly, I don't have one. I was hoping for land I could maybe farm or sell or something. I didn't expect to find a family already here." "And now that you have?" He looked around the kitchen, at Emma's drawings on the refrigerator, at the worn spot on the floor where countless feet had walked between the stove and the sink, at the growth marks penciled on the doorframe showing years of children getting taller. This wasn't just a house. It was a home built from memories and daily routines, and the kind of love that showed up in small details like cookies on good days and pictures stuck to refrigerators. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I know I can't just kick you out. These kids, they belong here." Clara studied his face for a long moment. "You know what the bank said when they started foreclosure proceedings? That we were impeding the productive use of the property, like children playing in their own yard, was somehow criminal. What happened to the crews they sent out?" A smile played at the corners of Clara's mouth, but it wasn't entirely pleasant. "Funny thing about that. First crew came out with a bulldozer to clear some of the outbuildings. Machine broke down 3 times in one day. Different problems each time: hydraulic failure, engine trouble, electrical issues. Took them a week to get it running again, and by then their contract had expired. Coincidence? Could be. Second crew was more persistent. Brought their own equipment, started bright and early on a Monday morning. By Wednesday, they'd had 2 men hurt in separate accidents. One fell off a ladder that had been fine the day before. Another got stung by a whole nest of wasps that seemed to come out of nowhere. Their tools kept disappearing overnight, showing up in strange places the next day. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. And the third crew lasted exactly 1 day. Claimed they heard voices in the walls, doors slamming. When no one was around, swore the house was haunted. Clara's expression was carefully neutral. Course, old houses make all kinds of noises, especially when the wind picks up, but you don't think it was the wind. Clara didn't answer directly. Instead, she stood and began clearing the table, moving with the efficient grace of someone who'd performed this routine thousands of times. "This land has been in the Whitmore family for 4 generations, Mr. Chun. My husband grew up in this house. His father before him and his grandfather before that. There's a lot of history in these walls. Good history or bad history. Both. Same as any place that's been home to real people for real time." She paused at the sink, her back to him. "But the Whitmores have always protected their own. And sometimes that protection doesn't end just because someone's passed on." A crash of thunder rolled across the sky outside, and Marcus realized that while they'd been eating, clouds had moved in. The kitchen windows flickered with the first drops of rain, and the wind picked up enough to rattle the glass. "Storm's coming," Clara observed. "You'll want to head back to town before it gets bad. These country roads can be treacherous when they're wet." Marcus looked out at the gathering darkness, then at his truck parked in the drive. The smart thing would be to leave now, drive back to town, find a motel room for the night, and figure out his next move in the morning. But something made him hesitate. What if I stayed? He heard himself asking. Clara turned, surprise flickering across her face. "Stayed where?" "Here. The barn, maybe. Or even just my truck. I don't want to impose. But ... He gestured toward the window, where rain was beginning to fall in earnest. "And maybe tomorrow we could talk about this situation. Really talk. Figure out something that works for everyone." Clara was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. From the living room came the sound of children's voices, Sarah reading a story to the little ones before bedtime. Normal family sounds, the kind that made a house feel alive. "Barn's got a leak in the roof," she said finally. "And it gets cold at night. There's a couch in the front room that's seen better days, but it's warm and dry." "I couldn't. You could." "And you will," Clara interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "No sense in anyone driving these roads in weather like this. And besides..." She paused, something vulnerable flickering in her expression. "It's been a while since this house had a man's voice in it. Might do the children good, just for one." Night. As if summoned by her words, Emma appeared in the doorway, already in pajamas decorated with cartoon horses. "Mama, is Mr. Chun staying for story time?" Clara looked at Marcus, one eyebrow raised in question. "I'd like that," he said, surprised to find he meant it. And so Marcus Chun found himself sitting on a worn sofa in the Whitmore living room, listening to Sarah read Charlotte's Web to a collection of children in various stages of sleepiness. The storm outside grew stronger, rain drumming against the windows and wind moaning around the eaves. But inside, the house felt solid and safe, filled with the kind of warmth that came from people who belonged together. As Emma fell asleep against his shoulder, and Tommy's questions finally trailed off into yawns, Marcus realized he was sitting in the middle of everything he'd spent his adult life looking for. Not the property or the investment opportunity or the fresh start he'd thought he wanted. He was sitting in the middle of a family. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt like he might actually belong somewhere. Marcus woke to the sound of small feet on hardwood floors and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling and the weight of a quilt he didn't remember covering himself with, he thought he might be dreaming. Then Emma's voice drifted from the kitchen, asking if they could make pancakes for the nice man, and reality settled back into place. He was lying on the Whitmore family couch, in a house he legally owned, but had no right to claim, listening to a family go about their morning routine around him. The storm had passed sometime during the night, leaving the air clean and cool, sunlight streaming through windows that needed washing but somehow made everything look golden anyway. "You're awake," Clara said from the kitchen doorway. She was already dressed, her hair pulled back, holding a steaming mug. "Coffee's ready if you want some." Marcus sat up, trying to work the kinks out of his neck. The couch was about 6 inches too short for his frame, but it had been warm and dry, and he'd slept better than he had in weeks. "Thank you. For last night, I mean." "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Clara interrupted, handing him the mug. "This house has rules about hospitality. My husband's grandmother would roll over in her grave if we let someone drive off in a storm." The coffee was strong and black, the kind that could wake the dead. Marcus wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic and tried to figure out how to navigate this strange new dynamic. He owned this place, but Clara was clearly still in charge of it. The legal situation was one thing. The human situation was something else entirely. "Kids are getting ready for school," Clara said, settling into the chair across from him. "Sarah drives them in the old pickup when it's running. Today's one of the good days." Through the kitchen doorway, Marcus could see the controlled chaos of getting 6 children ready for the day. Sarah was braiding Emma's hair while David helped Michael find his backpack. Tommy was at the table eating cereal and swinging his legs. And the 2 babies were in high chairs, more food on their faces than in their mouths. "What about you?" Marcus asked. "Do you work?" Clara's laugh was short and not entirely pleasant. "I work every day. Just not the kind that comes with a paycheck. There's the garden, the chickens, the house, the kids." She gestured vaguely toward the window. "Used to help out at the diner in town, but that was before the babies came. Hard to find childcare when you can't afford to pay for it." Marcus thought about his own scattered work history, the series of temporary jobs and day labor that had never added up to anything stable. At least his failures had only affected himself. Clara was trying to hold together a life for 7 people with no resources and no help. "The ranch," he said carefully, "before everything went wrong." "What was it like?" Clara's expression softened slightly. "Beautiful, profitable even. My father-in-law ran cattle, some horses. Nothing fancy, but enough to make a good living. The land's good, plenty of water, decent pasture. Jack, my husband, he had plans to expand. Maybe try some organic farming, sell direct to restaurants in the city. What happened? Life happened. Jack got called up for his second deployment right when the market was shifting. Beef prices dropped, feed costs went up. His father tried to keep things going, but he was getting older, and without Jack's help, double quote, she shrugged. Then Jack didn't come home, and he just broke. Lost his son and his purpose all at once. Started drinking, stopped working. By the time the cancer took him, the bills had piled up too high to dig out from under. Marcus had seen that pattern before. Families destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. But usually he'd been on the outside looking in, temporary help hired to clean up after other people's disasters. This time felt different. This time, he was part of the story. A horn honked outside, and Sarah appeared in the living room with a backpack over her shoulder and car keys in her hand. "Taking the kids to school," she announced. "Tommy, David, Michael, Emma, move it." There was a flurry of activity as children grabbed lunches, backpacks, and jackets. Emma stopped to wave goodbye to Marcus, her smile bright and uncomplicated. Tommy paused long enough to ask if Marcus would still be there when they got home, a question that made Clara's expression tighten slightly. "We'll see," Marcus said, which seemed to satisfy the boy. After the older children left, the house felt larger and quieter. Clara moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, feeding the babies, tidying the kitchen, starting a load of laundry in a machine that sounded like it was held together with prayer and duct tape. Marcus found himself helping without being asked, holding Lucy while Clara changed Jake's diaper, carrying the laundry basket to the line outside. It was while they were hanging clothes that Clara first mentioned the neighbors, Mrs. Henderson. "From the next ranch over called yesterday," she said, pinning one of Tommy's shirts to the line. "Wanted to know if the stories about the auction were true. Whether someone had actually bought this place. What did you tell her?" "That it was none of her business. But word's going to spread. This is a small community, and people talk." Clara paused, a pillowcase half pinned to the line. "There's going to be questions about why you're here, what your intentions are, and there's going to be assumptions." Marcus understood. A single man staying with a widow and her children would generate exactly the kind of gossip that could make life difficult for everyone involved. "Maybe I should go," he said. "Maybe you should," Clara agreed, but she didn't sound entirely convinced. "Question is, where? You said yourself you've got nowhere else to go." Before Marcus could answer, the sound of a truck engine carried across the yard. Not the reliable rumble of Sarah's school run, but something heavier, more aggressive. Clara's expression immediately sharpened, and she stepped closer to the house. "Expecting someone?" Marcus asked. "No," Clara said. "And that's never a good sign out here." The truck that pulled into the yard was expensive and clean, the kind that had never seen real work. Behind the wheel sat a man in his 50s with silver hair and a suit that cost more than Marcus had made in his last month of steady employment. He stepped out of the truck with the confidence of someone who was used to being the most important person in any room he entered. "Mrs. Whitmore," he called out, his voice carrying the false warmth of a politician or a salesman. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" "Mr. Blackwood," Clara replied, her tone carefully neutral. "What brings you out here?" So this was Blackwood. Marcus remembered the name from some of the paperwork at the courthouse, though he couldn't recall the context. But Clara's body language told him everything he needed to know. This was not a friendly visit. "Well, I heard some interesting news from town," Blackwood said, his eyes moving from Clara to Marcus and back again. "Something about this property changing hands. Thought I'd come by and introduce myself to the new owner." He extended a hand toward Marcus with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Richard Blackwood. I own most of the development around these parts." Marcus shook the offered hand, noting the soft palm and firm grip of someone who made his living with words and paper rather than tools and sweat. "Marcus Chun." "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Chun." I have to say, I'm curious about your plans for this place. It's got tremendous potential, being so close to the new highway extension. Highway extension? Marcus looked to Clara, who was watching the conversation with barely concealed hostility. Oh, you haven't heard? Blackwood's smile widened. County approved a major development project last month. New highway connector, shopping center, residential subdivision. Going to transform this whole area. Turn it from ranching country into prime commercial real estate. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. And this property? Right in the sweet spot. With the right development plan, this land could be worth 20, maybe 30 times what you paid for it. Of course, that would require removing the existing ... obstacles. His eyes flicked meaningfully toward Clara. The existing family, you mean, Marcus said. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his tone. Well, yes. Can't very well build a shopping center on a family farmhouse, can we? But I'm sure a reasonable solution could be worked out. I've been trying to acquire this property for months, actually. The bank and I had an understanding. Before this unfortunate auction business. Clara stepped forward, her green eyes blazing. An understanding? Is that what you call threatening foreclosure if they didn't sell to you below market value? Now, Mrs. Whitmore, business is business. Nothing personal. Blackwood turned back to Marcus. The point is, Mr. Chun, you've stumbled into a very fortunate situation. I'd be willing to make you a generous offer for this property. Cash deal, close quickly. You could walk away with enough money to buy something much more suitable to your ... circumstances. The condescension in that last word made Marcus's jaw tighten. He'd been looked down on plenty of times in his life, but something about this particular brand of dismissal felt especially insulting. And if I'm not interested in selling? Blackwood's smile became less pleasant. Well, that would be ... unfortunate. This development is going forward one way or another. The county's already committed to the highway extension. Property values. In the path are going to become quite volatile. And then there's the matter of bringing this property up to current zoning standards, environmental regulations, tax assessments. He shrugged apologetically. Could get expensive very quickly. It was a threat, politely delivered but unmistakable. Marcus had heard variations of it before, the language of people who were used to getting their way through a combination of money and pressure. I'll need some time to think about it, Marcus said. Of course, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait forever. Blackwood handed Marcus a business card. Call me when you're ready to be reasonable. He climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and a lingering scent of expensive cologne. Marcus and Clara stood in the yard, watching until the truck disappeared around the bend. Well, Clara said finally, now you know what you're really dealing with. This isn't just about a cursed ranch anymore. This is about money, big money. Marcus looked down at the business card in his hand, then at the house where 2 babies were probably taking their morning nap, at the clothesline where children's clothes dried in the sun, at the woman beside him who'd been fighting to protect. All of it with nothing but determination and whatever supernatural help the Whitmore ghosts might provide. Clara, he said, I think we need to talk. Clara led Marcus to the front porch, away from the babies napping inside. They sat on the wooden steps, the morning sun warming their backs while a gentle breeze carried the scent of grass and wildflowers across the yard. It should have been peaceful, but the tension from Blackwood's visit hung between them like smoke. How long has he been circling? Marcus asked, turning Blackwood's business card over in his hands. About a year, Clara said, her voice tight. Started with friendly visits, asking about our future plans, then helpful suggestions about how hard it must be for a woman alone to manage so much property. When that didn't work, he got more direct. What kind of direct? Clara was quiet for a moment, her green eyes fixed on some point beyond the pasture. Offers to help with bills, Casual mentions of how expensive property taxes were getting. Questions about whether the kids might be better off in town, closer to schools and services. She turned to look at Marcus. He's good at making you feel like he's doing you a favor while he's taking everything you have. Marcus had met men like Blackwood before, smooth operators who could make stealing sound like charity. But this felt different. More personal. The bank, he said they had an understanding. Blackwood owns half the county, one way or another. When Will started missing mortgage payments, suddenly the bank wasn't interested in working out a payment plan. Foreclosure became the only option. Clara's hands clenched in her lap. Convenient, considering Blackwood had been sniffing around for months. But you fought it. Damn right I fought it. This isn't just property to me. My children were born in that house. Jack carved their names in the old oak tree when each one came home from the hospital. There's 4 generations of Whitmore family buried in the cemetery beyond the back pasture. Her voice grew fierce. I wasn't going to let some developer turn their graves into a parking lot. Marcus understood that kind of connection to place, even though he'd never experienced it himself. His childhood had been a series of temporary stops, foster homes and relatives' couches and group facilities, where you learned not to get attached to anything you couldn't carry. But he could see what it meant to Clara, could hear it in her voice. When she talked about her children's names carved in bark. The crews that kept having problems, he said. That was you? Clara's smile was sharp as a blade. Some of it. Though I think Jack and his father might have been lending a hand from wherever they ended up. She studied Marcus's face. You think? I'm crazy. I think you're a mother protecting her children. I've seen crazy, and it doesn't look like you. Something in Clara's expression softened. The first crew was easy enough. Sugar in the gas tank, loosened hydraulic fittings, a few well-placed. Nails in the right tires, basic sabotage. But the second crew. She shook her head. Things started happening that I can't explain. Tools appearing in places no one had left them. Equipment starting by itself in the middle of the night. That ladder that broke when the man fell, I checked it myself afterward. The wood had split in a way that shouldn't have been possible unless it had been weakened from the inside out. And the third crew? The one that heard voices? I was inside with the babies when they came. Never went near their equipment, never had a chance to interfere. But within an hour of them setting up, there were sounds coming from the walls like someone was walking around inside them. Doors slamming upstairs when there was no wind. The foreman swore he heard a man's voice telling them to get off his land. Marcus felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle. Jack's voice? Could have been. Or his father's. Or any of the Whitmore men who built this place and loved it. Clara met his eyes steadily. You don't have to believe it. But something in this house protects the family that belongs here. And it doesn't much care for outsiders who come with bad intentions. The implications of that hung in the air between them. Marcus was an outsider. He'd bought this place at auction without knowing anything about its history or the people who called it home. By any reasonable definition, he should be exactly the kind of threat that Whitmore ghosts would want to discourage. Why haven't I had any odd incidents? He asked. Clara tilted her head, considering. Maybe because you haven't shown any bad intentions yet. You could have called the sheriff yesterday, had us removed. Could have brought your own crew to clear us out. Instead, you stayed for dinner and slept on our couch and helped hang laundry. She paused. Or maybe because the kids like you, children, are good judges of character, and whatever's protecting this place seems to pay attention to what they think. A car door slammed in the distance, followed by the sound of children's voices. Sarah was back from the school run, probably having left the older kids in town and returned with supplies or errands completed. The normal sounds of family life resuming, even as the adults sat discussing ghosts and land developers and impossible choices. Marcus, Clara said, her voice taking on a different quality. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Okay, that money Blackwood mentioned. 20, 30 times what you paid for this place. That would be life-changing money for someone in your situation. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Here it was, the conversation he'd been dreading since Blackwood drove away. The moment when he'd have to choose between financial security and doing the right thing. Between his own desperate circumstances and a family that had nowhere else to go. It would be, he admitted. So why are we sitting here talking about how to fight him instead of how to split the proceeds? It was a fair question. A practical question. Marcus had been broke and homeless for weeks, sleeping in his truck, scraping by on day labor and charity. A windfall like Blackwood was offering could set him up for years, maybe for life if he was careful with it. All he had to do was sell out a family he'd known for less than 24 hours. Because, he said slowly, working through his thoughts as he spoke, I've spent my whole life being the kind of person who gets moved around for other people's convenience. Foster care, job sites, rental apartments where the landlord decides to renovate or sell, or just doesn't like your face. I know what it feels like to have no control over where you sleep at night. He looked out at the pasture where a few remaining cattle grazed peacefully, at the old barn that needed repair, but still stood solid after decades of weather, at the house where children's voices drifted from open windows. I've never owned anything that mattered, he continued. Never had the power to decide what happens to a place or to the people in it. And the first time I do, the first time someone's safety depends on a choice I make, double quotes, he shrugged. I can't be the guy who takes the money and walks away. Clara was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd heard it since they met. That's going to cost you. Blackwood's not the type to take no for an answer politely. He's got resources, connections, ways of making life difficult for people who get in his way. What kind of ways? Property tax reassessments, zoning violations, building code inspections that find problems that weren't there the week before. He's got friends in the county government and the sheriff's department. Clara's expression was grim. And if the legal pressure doesn't work, he's got other options. The kind of men who don't ask polite questions. Marcus had dealt with intimidation before, though usually from foremen or creditors rather than land developers. But the principle was the same. Rich people who were used to getting their way and had no patience for obstacles. So what do? Clara raised an eyebrow. I'm not going anywhere, Marcus said, surprised by his own certainty. This is my property now, legally speaking. That gives me some rights, some leverage. Maybe not much, but more than you'd have fighting him alone. And the kids? You ready to have 6 children depending on you? Because that's what you're signing up for if you stay and fight. Marcus thought about Emma falling asleep against his shoulder the night before, about Tommy's serious questions and Sarah's protective instincts and Michael's methodical way of arranging his vegetables. About 2 babies who would grow up with no memory of their father and older children who would carry the weight of loss their whole lives. Yeah, he said, I think I am. Clara nodded slowly, as if she'd been testing him and he'd given the right answer. Then we need to make this official. Whatever arrangement we work out, it needs to be legal and binding. Something Blackwood can't challenge in court. What did you have in mind? Partnership. You own the land. I know how to work it. We rebuild the ranch operation, make it profitable again. You get a home and a business. My kids get stability and a future. Clara's eyes were bright with possibility. It won't be easy. The place needs a lot of work, and starting from scratch with no capital. Double quotes, she shrugged. But the land is good, and the water rights alone are valuable. If we can get some cattle, maybe some horses, market directly to restaurants in the city, like Jack always wanted to do. You really think it could work? I think it's worth trying. Better than sitting here waiting for Blackwood to find another way to force us out. Sarah appeared around the corner of the house, leading Lucy by the hand while Jake toddled behind. Them. The two babies had clearly been up from their nap for a while, their faces flushed with outdoor play and their clothes grass-stained from whatever adventure they'd been having in the yard. "Mama," Sarah called out, "Jake needs changing, and Lucy's asking for a snack." "Be right there," Clara called back, then turned to Marcus. "Think about it, really think about it. Because once we start down this road, there's no going back. Blackwood won't give up easy, and the work ahead of us won't be just hard. It'll be the kind of hard that tests everything you think you know about yourself." Marcus watched Sarah scoop up Jake while Lucy climbed the porch steps toward them, her chubby arms reaching for her mother. This was what he'd be fighting for, not just property or principle, but the right of children to grow up in the place they belonged, surrounded by the people who loved them. "I don't need to think about it," he said. "I'm in." Clara smiled, the first genuinely happy expression he'd seen from her since they'd met. "Then we better get started, because Blackwood's not going to wait around for us to get organized." As if summoned by her words, the phone rang inside the house. Clara went to answer it, leaving Marcus alone on the porch with Lucy, who had settled beside him and was examining his shoelaces with intense toddler concentration. Through the open door, he could hear Clara's side of the conversation. "Yes, this is Mrs. Whitmore. What kind of inspection? Tomorrow morning, I see." When she came back outside, her expression was grim. "That was the county building inspector," she said. "Seems we're scheduled for a routine safety inspection tomorrow morning. Funny thing is, we've never had one before in all the years we've lived here." Marcus felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Blackwood's moving fast. Faster than I expected. Which means we need to move faster too. Clara's jaw was set with determination. "Looks like our partnership just became official. Ready for your first test, partner." Marcus looked out at the ranch that was now his responsibility, at the family that was now depending on him, at the fight that was just beginning. 24 hours ago, he'd been a homeless drifter with nothing to lose. Now he had everything to lose and everything to fight for. "Ready as I'll ever be," he said, and meant it. The county building inspector arrived at exactly 8 in the morning, driving a pristine white truck with official seals and carrying a clipboard thick enough to choke a horse. Marcus had been up since 5, helping Clara prepare for what they both knew would be anything but a routine inspection. Inspector Dale Morrison was a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the demeanor of someone who enjoyed finding problems. He stepped out of his truck wearing a pressed uniform and an expression that suggested he'd already written his report before seeing the property. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said with forced politeness, not bothering to shake hands. "I'm here to conduct the safety inspection we discussed." "Mr. Morrison," Clara replied evenly. "This is Marcus Chen, the new property owner." Morrison's eyes flicked to Marcus with barely concealed disdain, taking in his work boots and flannel shirt. "Mr. Chen, I trust you understand the seriousness of bringing a property into compliance with current county standards." "I'm learning," Marcus said, keeping his voice neutral despite the man's obvious hostility. "Well, let's get started then." Morrison consulted his clipboard. "I'll need to inspect the main house, all outbuildings, septic system, well water, electrical systems, and structural integrity." Standard procedure. What followed was 3 hours of the most thorough and hostile property inspection Marcus had ever witnessed. Morrison found problems that defied logic and reason. The front porch steps, which had supported the weight of 4 generations of Whitmores, were suddenly structurally unsound due to excessive wear patterns. The kitchen wiring, which had been updated just 5 years earlier according to Clara, was deemed potentially hazardous because of inadequate grounding protocols. In the barn, Morrison declared the hayloft unsafe, despite the fact that it had held tons of hay for decades without incident. The chicken coop, which housed a modest flock of laying hens, violated current livestock housing regulations that Marcus was fairly certain had been written, specifically for commercial operations, not family farms. But it was when Morrison got to the children's bedrooms that the inspection took on a particularly vindictive tone. "This room," Morrison said, standing in Emma and Lucy's shared bedroom, "exceeds the maximum occupancy for a space this size. 2 children in a room of these dimensions violates current housing codes." "It's a perfectly adequate bedroom," Clara said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "My girls have been happy here for years." "I'm not concerned with happiness, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm concerned with compliance." Morrison made notes on his clipboard. "The window in this room also lacks proper egress capabilities. In case of fire, these children would be trapped." Marcus looked at the window in question, a large, easily open double-hung window that was less than 4 feet from the ground outside. Any reasonably agile child could climb through it without difficulty. Morrison's objection was ridiculous, and they all knew it. What would it take to bring the window into compliance? Marcus asked. Morrison smiled, the expression sharp and unpleasant. "Complete replacement with a certified egress window, installed by a licensed contractor. Cost would probably run $3,000 to $5,000 per window." They moved through the house methodically, Morrison finding violations that ranged from creative interpretations of building codes to outright fabrications. The bathroom needed a new exhaust fan. The stairs required updated railings. The foundation showed concerning settlement patterns that demanded immediate structural engineering consultation. By the time they reached the basement, Marcus was beginning to understand the scope of what they were facing. This wasn't an inspection. It was a demolition by bureaucracy, designed to generate a repair bill so massive that any reasonable person would choose to sell rather than fight. "Electrical panels completely out of date," Morrison announced, shining his flashlight on the breaker box that controlled the house's power. "This type of system hasn't been code compliant for years. Fire hazard." "That panel was installed in 2018, Clara said flatly. "I have the permits and inspection records." Morrison didn't even look at her. "Standards change, Mrs. Whitmore. What was acceptable then isn't acceptable now. That was when the lights went out. Not just the basement lights, every light in the house. The electrical hum that every occupied house carries went silent, leaving them standing in the dimness of the basement with only Morrison's flashlight for illumination." "Well," Morrison said with obvious satisfaction, "I'd say that proves my point about the electrical system." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool basement air. He'd been around construction long enough to know that electrical panels didn't just fail on their own, especially ones that had been working perfectly moments before. But as he looked around the basement, something else caught his attention. The temperature had dropped noticeably. He could see his breath misting in the flashlight beam, and the concrete walls seemed to radiate cold like they were made of ice instead of stone. Morrison, focused on his clipboard, didn't seem to notice. "Mr. Morrison," Clara said, her voice carefully controlled, "perhaps we should go back upstairs and check the main breaker." "No need," Morrison replied, making more notes. "I've seen enough. This electrical system is condemned as of right now. The house is unsafe for habitation until it's completely rewired." The flashlight beam flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. For just a moment, Marcus thought he saw something move in the darkness beyond the light, a figure standing near the far wall watching them. But when Morrison steadied the flashlight, there was nothing there. "We should definitely go upstairs," Marcus said, feeling increasingly uneasy about their situation. "Just finishing my notes," Morrison muttered, still writing. "Let's see. Electrical condemnation, structural concerns, occupancy violations." A sound echoed through the basement, a deep, hollow knocking that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. Morrison looked up from his clipboard, his confident expression flickering for the first time. "What was that?" "Old house," Clara said simply. They make noises. The knocking came again, louder this time, and with it, a sound like footsteps overhead. Slow, deliberate footsteps walking across the living room floor. Morrison's flashlight beam wavered as his hand began to shake slightly. "Is someone else in the house?" he asked. "Just the babies," Clara said, "taking their morning nap." The footsteps overhead stopped directly above them, followed by a long moment of silence. Then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond the flashlight beam, came the sound of a man's voice, low, indistinct, but unmistakably angry. Morrison went white. "Who is that? Who's down here with us?" "I don't hear anything," Clara said, though Marcus could see she was listening intently. The voice came again, clearer this time, and Marcus felt every hair on his body stand up. Because the voice was saying words, actual words, though he couldn't quite make them out. But the tone was unmistakable. It was the voice of someone who was very, very unhappy about strangers being in his house. Morrison's flashlight swung wildly around the basement, illuminating empty corners and dusty shelves. "There's someone down here. I can hear them." "I think we should go upstairs now," Marcus said firmly, moving toward the stairs. But as Morrison turned to follow, the flashlight went out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. In the silence that followed, they could all hear breathing. Slow, steady breathing that wasn't coming from any of the three people standing frozen in the basement. Morrison let out a sound that might have been a whimper. A light appeared at the top of the stairs, Clara's emergency lantern casting a warm yellow glow down into the basement. "Come on up," she called. "I'll make some coffee while we wait for the power company." They climbed the stairs quickly, Morrison stumbling in his haste to get out of the basement. Behind them, Marcus heard what sounded like someone laughing, a low, satisfied chuckle that followed them up into the kitchen. The main floor of the house was significantly warmer than the basement had been, and somehow the morning sunlight streaming through the windows made everything feel normal again. Clara moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, starting coffee on the gas stove that didn't require electricity. Morrison stood near the door, his earlier confidence completely shattered. His clipboard shook in his hands, and he kept glancing toward the basement door as if expecting something to emerge from it. "Power outages happen sometimes," Clara said, conversationally handing Morrison a cup of coffee. "Usually comes back on in an hour or two." Morrison took the coffee with trembling hands. "There was someone in that basement." "I heard them. Old houses settle," Marcus said. "Makes all kinds of sounds. That wasn't settling. That was a voice. Someone was down there with us." Clara exchanged a glance with Marcus. "Well, you're welcome to go back down and look around if you'd like. I'm sure it was just the pipes or something." Morrison looked toward the basement door and shuddered visibly. No, I think I've seen enough for today." He pulled out his clipboard and began writing frantically, his previous methodical approach replaced by obvious haste to finish and leave. "So what's the verdict?" Marcus asked. Morrison looked up from his notes, his face pale and sweaty despite the cool morning air. "There are issues, significant issues that need to be addressed, such as the electrical system needs updating, and there are some structural concerns, but..." He hesitated, glancing again toward the basement. "But I think we can work something out. Maybe a gradual compliance schedule. Spread the work out over time." Clara raised an eyebrow. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Morrison." "Yes, well, these things don't always have to be immediate." Morrison was backing toward the door as he spoke. "I'll have my report ready by end of week. We can discuss a reasonable timeline for addressing the issues." He was out the door and in his truck within minutes, gravel spraying as he drove away faster than was probably safe on the winding ranch road. Marcus and Clara stood on the porch, watching the dust settle in his wake. "That went better than expected," Clara said. "Better?" "He found about $30,000 worth of violations. He found $30,000 worth of violations and then had a conversation with my father-in-law, Clara corrected. Big difference. As if summoned by her words, the lights came back on inside the house. The hum of electrical current resumed, and somewhere in the distance, Marcus could hear the refrigerator motor kick in. Your father-in-law? Will Whitmore. Jack's father. He built most of this house with his own hands, wired it himself, laid every piece of foundation. He doesn't much care for strangers coming in and criticizing his work. Marcus thought about the voice in the basement, the sudden cold, the way Morrison's confidence had evaporated the moment the lights went out. And you think he'll help us again? If we need it? Clara smiled, and for the first time since Marcus had met her, it was completely without reservation. Honey, you're family now. The Whitmore men have always protected their family. Death doesn't change that. The sound of children's voices carried across the yard as Sarah's truck returned with the kids from their morning activities. Normal life. Resuming, as if they hadn't just witnessed a building inspector being terrorized by a dead man who didn't appreciate people threatening his family's home. Marcus realized he was smiling too. For the first time in his adult life, he was part of something that would fight for him the same way he was willing to fight for it. He belonged somewhere that would protect him, even from beyond the grave. So what's next? He asked. Next, we wait for Morrison's report and see how reasonable his timeline really is. And we start making plans to rebuild this ranch for real. Clara looked out at the pasture, her eyes bright with possibility. Because Blackwood's not going to give up after one failed inspection. This is just the beginning. Marcus nodded, following her gaze across the land that was now his responsibility. And his hope. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard the sound of approval, a deep, satisfied chuckle that might have been the wind, or might have been something else entirely. 3 weeks after Morrison's terrified retreat, Marcus stood in the pre-dawn darkness of the barn, learning the rhythm that would define his new life. The milk hit the bucket in steady streams, while Bessie, the older of the 2 remaining cows, chewed contentedly on the hay he'd provided. It was work he'd never imagined himself doing, but there was something satisfying about the simple reliability of it. Cows needed milking twice a day, regardless of weather, mood, or the complications of dealing with corrupt county officials. Clara had been right about the work ahead being hard. But she'd been wrong about one thing. It wasn't testing what he knew about himself. It was teaching him things he'd never had the chance to learn. The partnership they'd formed was more complex than either of them had initially imagined. Clara brought knowledge of farming, ranching, and managing a household that ran on determination and careful budgeting. Marcus brought construction skills, basic mechanical knowledge, and something neither of them had expected. An intuitive understanding of how to make broken things work again. You've got good hands, Clara had told him the previous week, watching him jury-rig a repair on the old tractor's hydraulic system using salvaged parts and creative engineering. Jack would have liked working with you. It was the first time she'd mentioned her husband in relation to Marcus as anything other than a comparison or a memory, and it had felt like acceptance of a different kind. Not just tolerance of his presence, but recognition that he might actually belong here. The kitchen was warm and bright when Marcus brought the milk in. Breakfast already in progress under Sarah's capable management. The 16-year-old had taken over more responsibility as the partnership between her mother and Marcus developed, stepping into a role that was part older sister, part assistant ranch manager. Morrison's report came yesterday, Clara said without preamble, handing Marcus a cup of coffee. Certified mail. Marcus felt his stomach clench. They'd been living in a strange kind of suspended animation since the inspection, waiting for the official word on what repairs would be required and how much time they'd have to complete them. How bad? Clara's expression was unreadable. Could be worse. Could be better. He's giving us 6 months to address the major safety concerns, and 18 months for the structural improvements. That's more reasonable than I expected. It's still expensive. Even doing most of the work ourselves, we're looking at $15,000 minimum. Maybe 20 if we hit complications. Marcus did quick math in his head. His savings account contained exactly $47. Clara's financial situation wasn't much better. They'd need to find a way to generate significant income while simultaneously investing in costly repairs. A classic catch-22 that had probably driven more than one family off their land. What about the cattle operation? Marcus asked. You said the land could support a decent herd. Could and should. But cattle cost money up front, and we'd need fencing, feed, veterinary care. Even starting small, we'd need at least $10,000 to do it right. Sarah looked up from where she was helping Emma with her breakfast. What about the farmer's market? Clara and Marcus both turned to her. The girl had been quietly listening, while managing the morning chaos of getting 6 children fed and ready for their day. What farmer's market? Clara asked. The one in Millbrook. Mrs. Henderson was telling me about it when I was in town yesterday. Apparently there's a new one starting up, focused on local organic produce. High-end stuff for city people who drive. Out on weekends, Marcus felt a spark of interest. What kind of produce? Vegetables, herbs, eggs, honey. That sort of thing. Mrs. Henderson said they're looking for vendors, especially ones who can provide consistently. Sarah wiped Emma's face with practiced efficiency. She mentioned that organic eggs are selling for $6 a dozen. Clara nearly choked on her coffee. $6 for a dozen eggs? From free-range, organically fed chickens, which is basically what we have already. Marcus looked out the kitchen window toward the chicken coop, where about 20 hens were pecking around in the dirt. Nothing fancy, just good healthy birds living the way chickens were supposed to live. If they could get them certified organic and expand the flock ... double quotes, how many eggs are we getting now? He asked. About 8 dozen a week, Clara said. Sometimes more in summer. At $6 a dozen, that's close to $50 a week. Just from the chickens we already have. Plus vegetables, Sarah added. Mama's garden produces way more than we can eat. And there's that herb section that Grandpa Will planted years ago. Rosemary, thyme, sage, all kinds of stuff that sells. For premium prices at markets. Marcus felt the first real hope he'd experienced since Morrison's visit. It wasn't a complete solution, but it was a start. A way to generate income while they built towards something larger. What would it take to get certified organic? He asked. Clara was already thinking ahead, her expression shifting from cautious to calculating. There's paperwork, inspections, waiting periods. But we're already farming organically, never had money for chemicals anyway. The certification is mainly about documentation and compliance. And the farmer's market? I'd need to apply for a vendor permit, get the proper insurance, probably invest in some display equipment. She paused, doing mental math. Few $100 to get started properly. Maybe $500 to do it right. $500. Marcus looked around the kitchen, at the mismatched chairs and patched walls and children eating breakfast from plates that didn't match. $500. Might as well have been $5,000, given their current resources. I might have an idea about that, he said slowly. After the children left for school and the little ones were settled with their morning activities, Marcus and Clara walked out to examine the equipment shed behind the barn. It was a metal building that had seen better decades, but the contents were what interested Marcus. Jack's father was a collector, Clara explained, pulling aside a tarp to reveal a row of vintage farm equipment. Never threw anything away that might someday be useful. Marcus walked along the row of machinery, his trained eye assessing condition and potential value. There was a 1950s Ford tractor that needed work but had good bones. A hay rake that looked like it had been maintained with care. Several pieces of equipment he couldn't immediately identify but that bore the solid construction of an era when things were built to last. Any of this still work? Some of it. The tractor ran until about 3 years ago, when Will got too sick to maintain it. The hay equipment was used every summer until she trailed off, until her husband died and her father-in-law lost the will to keep up with farming. Marcus understood. He'd seen plenty of operations that fell apart when key people disappeared. From the equation, what do you think it's worth? Clara shrugged. As scrap metal? Maybe a few $100s. To the right buyer, someone who restores vintage equipment. She looked at the tractor with something like affection. Could be worth several thousand. But finding that buyer, getting it transported ... Leave that to me, Marcus said. He'd spent enough time on construction sites to know the network of people who bought, sold, and traded equipment. Someone was always looking for a project, especially if the price was right. That afternoon, while Clara worked in her garden and the children played in the yard, Marcus spent 3 hours on the phone. Old contacts from construction jobs, mechanics he'd worked with, even a few dealers who specialized in vintage equipment. By evening, he had 3 potential buyers lined up and a clear plan. Henderson's Restoration in Colorado Springs will take the lot, he told Clara over dinner. Sight unseen, based on the photos I took. $1,500 for everything. Clara's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. $1,500. Cash. They'll even handle transportation if we can get the equipment to the main road. For a moment, Clara looked like she might cry. Marcus realized that $1,500 represented more liquid cash than the family had seen in months, maybe years. That's enough for the farmer's market startup, Sarah said quietly. And some left over. For the organic certification. It's enough for a lot of things, Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. Marcus, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. We're partners, remember? That evening, after the children were in bed, Marcus and Clara sat on the front porch planning their next moves. The equipment sale would provide startup capital for the farmer's market venture. If that succeeded, they could reinvest the profits into expanding the chicken operation, maybe adding some sheep or goats. Eventually, with enough saved, they could begin rebuilding the cattle herd that had once made the ranch profitable. It's going to take time, Clara warned. Years before we're really profitable. And there's no guarantee the market will work out. Nothing's guaranteed, Marcus agreed. But this feels right. Sustainable, something we can build on. A cool breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The sounds of the ranch settling into evening, peaceful and familiar despite the fact that Marcus had only been part of it for a month. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, Clara said softly. For Blackwood to try something else, or for you to realize what you've gotten yourself into and decide it's too much trouble. Marcus understood the fear. Both of them had learned to expect disappointment, to guard against hope that might lead to greater hurt. But sitting on that porch, listening to the quiet sounds of home, he felt something he'd never experienced before, the confidence that came from building something real with someone who shared the work and the risk. I'm not going anywhere, he said. This is home now. Clara nodded, and they sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out over the ranch that was slowly becoming theirs in every way that mattered. In the distance, Marcus thought he heard the faint sound of approval, a whisper of wind through the grass that might have been voices. Old voices welcoming him to the family. The next morning brought their first real test. Marcus was in the barn when he heard the sound of vehicles approaching, not one truck, but several. He stepped outside to see a convoy of black SUVs pulling into the yard, expensive vehicles that looked out of place against the rural backdrop. Blackwood stepped out of the lead vehicle, but he wasn't alone this time. 3 men in dark suits emerged from the other cars, moving with the careful awareness of people who were comfortable with violence. Clara appeared on the porch, and Marcus could see her calculating distances, exit routes, ways to protect the children if this went bad. "Mr. Chun," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "I think it's time we had a serious conversation about your future here." Marcus walked toward the group, aware of Clara positioning herself between the strangers and the house, aware of small faces appearing at windows. Whatever Blackwood had come to say, Marcus doubted it would be as polite as their last conversation. The real fight was about to begin. The three men in dark suits spread out as they approached, moving with the practiced coordination of people who'd done this before. Marcus recognized the type, not quite muscle, not quite legitimate business, but something in between that made them dangerous in ways that were hard to predict. Blackwood himself looked different than during his previous visit. Gone was the polished charm and political smile. This was a man who'd run out of patience for subtlety, and the cold calculation in his eyes made Marcus's stomach tighten with unease. "Beautiful morning," Blackwood said, his tone conversational despite the obvious intimidation factor of his companions. "Perfect weather for making difficult decisions." "What kind of decisions?" Marcus asked, positioning himself so he could see both Blackwood and the men flanking him. "The kind that determine whether people get hurt unnecessarily." Blackwood's smile was sharp as a blade. "You see, Mr. Chun, I've done some research since our last conversation. Turns out you're not exactly the stable landowner I initially assumed." Marcus felt ice form in his veins. Whatever Blackwood had discovered, it wasn't going to be good. Construction worker, mostly day labor, no permanent address for the past 6 months. No significant assets, no credit history worth mentioning. Blackwood consulted a folder one of his men handed him. 3 arrests for trespassing on construction sites after hours, though the charges were dropped. Suspected of minor theft, though nothing was ever proven. Those charges were irrelevant, Blackwood interrupted. What's relevant is the pattern they establish. A man with no roots, no stability, no legitimate means of supporting himself suddenly acquiring valuable property for practically nothing. Makes a person wonder about his true motivations. Marcus realized where this was heading. Blackwood was building a narrative that would paint him as a criminal, someone who'd acquired the property through fraud or worse. "I bought this land legally." "At a public auction," Marcus said. "Legal, yes. But was it honest?" Blackwood gestured toward the house, where Clara stood on the porch with Lucy in her arms. "Seems awfully convenient that a homeless drifter would show up just in time to rescue a desperate widow and her children. Almost like someone had inside information about the auction, about the property's value." The accusation hung in the air, like poison. Marcus could see what Blackwood was implying, that he'd somehow conspired with Clara to defraud the county, that their partnership was evidence of a scam rather than a genuine attempt to save a family's home. That's not how it happened, isn't it? A woman with 6 children to feed, facing eviction, suddenly finds a knight in shining armor willing to pay her debts and let her stay? Blackwood's voice took on the tone of someone addressing a jury. "Sounds like fraud to me. Conspiracy to defraud the county of legitimate tax revenue." One of the suited men stepped closer, and Marcus caught a glimpse of a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. These weren't just investigators or lawyers. These were people prepared for violence if negotiation failed. "What do you want, Blackwood?" "Same thing I've always wanted. This property cleared and ready for development. The difference is, now I'm prepared to make things very unpleasant for everyone involved if I don't get it." Blackwood nodded toward his companions. "These gentlemen represent some of my business associates who have significant investments in the highway development project. They're not as patient as I am with obstacles." The threat was crystal clear. Marcus had seen this playbook before, though usually in urban settings where developers wanted to clear out poor neighborhoods for gentrification. Economic pressure, legal harassment, and when those failed, the kind of intimidation that made people disappear in the middle of the night. "You're threatening us." "I'm explaining reality," Blackwood replied. This development is happening whether you cooperate or not. The question is whether you walk away with enough money to start over somewhere else, or whether you find out what happens to people who stand in the way of progress. From the house came the sound of children's voices, Sarah's laughter mixing with Tommy's excited chatter about something he'd learned in school. Normal family sounds that seemed surreal against the backdrop of barely veiled threats and armed men. Marcus felt something shift inside him, the same protective instinct that had made him step between danger and vulnerability when Luke had threatened Clara in the original timeline. But this was different. This was his family now, his responsibility, and he wasn't going to let anyone threaten them without consequences. And if we refuse, Blackwood's expression hardened. Then accidents happen, equipment failures, structural problems that require immediate evacuation for safety reasons. Sometimes people get hurt when they're stubborn about accepting help. The largest of the three men, a thick-set individual with scarred knuckles, cracked his neck meaningfully. The sound was loud in the morning air, deliberate and threatening. I had hoped we could resolve this like civilized people, Blackwood continued. But civilization requires all parties to be reasonable. Are you prepared to be reasonable, Mr. Chun? Marcus looked at the house where Clara stood protecting her children, at the land they'd been working to restore, at the future they'd been building together, one careful piece at a time. Everything he'd ever wanted was right here, threatened by men who saw families as obstacles to profit. I need time to think about it, he said finally. Blackwood smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course, take all the time you need. But don't take too long. My associates are eager to move forward with their project, and their patience has limits. The men began moving back toward their vehicles, but Blackwood lingered for a moment longer. One more thing, Mr. Chun. I'd be very careful about relying on the ... local legends about this property. Ghosts and curses make interesting stories, but they don't stop bullets or building permits. And sometimes, when people depend too heavily on supernatural protection, they forget to take proper precautions in the real world. With that warning, Blackwood climbed into his SUV and led his convoy back down the ranch road, leaving behind the smell of expensive cologne and the lingering threat of violence. Marcus stood in the yard until the dust settled, his mind racing through possibilities and plans. Clara approached from the house, her face pale but determined. How much did you hear? He asked. Enough. Sarah took the little ones upstairs when she saw the cars coming. Clara's voice was steady, but Marcus could see the fear she was trying to hide. How bad is it? Bad. He's not just threatening financial pressure anymore. Those men weren't lawyers or bureaucrats. I know. I've seen the type before. Clara's expression was grim. When Jack was deployed, there were families back home who got visits like that. Usually from people who wanted to buy military wives out of their housing contracts for pennies on the dollar. Marcus understood. Predators who targeted vulnerable families, using intimidation and violence when legal methods failed. But this was worse because Blackwood had resources and connections that small-time criminals couldn't match. We need help, he said. Real help, legal help. With what money? Even if we could afford a lawyer. Blackwood owns half the legal establishment in this county. Marcus thought about the $1,500 from the equipment sale, money that had seemed like salvation just hours earlier. Now it felt like pocket change against the forces arrayed against them. What about the sheriff? Official law enforcement? Clara's laugh was bitter. Sheriff Morrison is Blackwood's golf partner. You think he's going to investigate threats against the people who embarrassed his building inspector? The sound of a vehicle approaching made them both tense, but this time it was Sarah's pickup returning from town. The teenager climbed out of the truck carrying grocery bags and immediately noticed the tension in the air. What's wrong? She asked. Setting down the bags, Clara filled her in quickly, keeping her voice low so the younger children wouldn't overhear. Sarah's expression grew increasingly grim as she learned about Blackwood's ultimatum and the men who delivered it. "So what do we do?" Sarah asked when Clara finished. It was a simple question that carried the weight of everything they'd been building together. Marcus looked at the two women who'd become his family, at the house that had become his home, at the land that represented the first real future he'd ever imagined for himself. "We fight," he said, "but we do it smart." Against men with guns and unlimited money? Against men who think they can intimidate people into giving up everything they love. Marcus felt a familiar stubborn determination settling into his bones, the same refusal to be pushed around that had gotten him through foster care and construction sites and sleeping in his truck. "They're counting on us being scared and isolated." "But we're not alone." "What do you mean?" "I mean there are other families in this county who've dealt with Blackwood's development projects. Other people who've been forced off their land or pressured into selling below market value." Marcus's mind was already working through possibilities. "And I mean that sometimes the best defense against people who fight dirty is to make sure everyone knows exactly what they're doing." Sarah's eyes lit up with understanding. "Publicity, documentation, make it too expensive for them to operate." "In the shadows, exactly. Blackwood's whole operation depends on being able to work quietly, to pressure people individually where no one can see what's happening. But if we can shine a light on his methods... You really think that will work?" Clara asked. Marcus looked at the house where children's voices drifted from open windows, at the garden Clara had spent years nurturing, at the cemetery beyond the back pasture where 4 generations of Whitmores rested beneath the soil they'd worked and loved. "I think it's worth trying. Because the alternative is letting them win, and I'm not ready to do that." As if summoned by his words, a cool breeze stirred the leaves of the old oak tree, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and something else, something that might have been approval from voices too old and too protective to let their family be threatened without consequence. The fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time since Blackwood's vehicles had appeared in their yard, Marcus felt like they might actually have a chance. "All right," Clara said, her voice gaining strength. "Where do we start?" Marcus smiled, feeling the first stirrings of hope. "We start by finding out exactly how many families Blackwood has destroyed. And then we make sure everyone knows their stories." The war for the Whitmore Ranch was about to become very public, very messy, and very personal. And Marcus was finally ready to fight for something that mattered more than his own survival. 6 weeks after Blackwood's ultimatum, Marcus stood before a packed courthouse meeting room, holding a manila folder that contained enough evidence to destroy a man's empire. The room buzzed with tension and anticipation as farmers, ranchers, and townspeople filled every available seat, their faces reflecting the mixture of hope and long-suppressed anger. The investigation had moved faster than anyone expected. Once word spread that someone was finally willing to challenge Blackwood publicly, the stories began pouring in. The Henderson family, forced to sell their century-old farm for a fraction of its value after mysterious zoning violations, appeared overnight. The Martinez Ranch, condemned through eminent domain for a highway extension that was later rerouted to benefit Blackwood's shopping center. 12 families in total, each with documentation of intimidation, fraudulent inspections, and economic pressure that had driven them from land their ancestors had worked for generations. Sarah had proven instrumental in organizing the evidence, her generation's comfort with technology helping to compile documents, photographs, and testimonies into a comprehensive case that painted a clear picture of systematic corruption. Even Emma had contributed, her innocent questions to neighbors revealing details that adults might have been too careful to share. But the real breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Dale Morrison, the building inspector who'd fled their basement in terror, had approached them 3 weeks earlier with a confession that had blown the case wide open. Apparently, Facing the Whitmore family spirits had triggered a crisis of conscience that Blackwood's money couldn't silence. "I've been taking bribes for 2 years," Morrison had admitted, sitting at their kitchen table with shaking hands. "Blackwood pays me to find violations on properties he wants to acquire and to overlook problems on his own developments. I've got records, canceled checks, recorded phone conversations where he tells me exactly what to find." The evidence Morrison provided was damning, a paper trail that connected Blackwood to county commissioners, bank officials, and even members of the sheriff's department. A network of corruption that had been operating openly because no one had ever challenged it effectively. Now, as Marcus looked out at the crowd gathered for the emergency county commission meeting, he felt the weight of all those families' hopes resting on his shoulders. Clara sat in the front row with the children, her green eyes steady and encouraging. Behind them, he could see faces he'd come to know over the past month, neighbors who'd become allies, friends who'd become family. Commissioner Patricia Vaughn, the one member of the county board who hadn't been touched by Blackwood's influence, called the meeting to order. "We're here today to address allegations of misconduct in county development processes," she announced. "Mr. Chun, you have the floor." Marcus stood, his mouth dry but his resolve solid. He'd faced down hostile foremen, aggressive creditors, and the uncertainty of homelessness. But this was different. This time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. 6 months ago, I was sleeping in my truck with nowhere to go and nothing to lose, he began. I bought a piece of land for $5, thinking I'd found a bargain. What I actually found was a family. And what I learned was that Richard Blackwood has been destroying families like mine for profit. He opened the folder and began laying out the evidence, piece by methodical piece. The fraudulent inspection reports, the intimidation tactics, the network of bribes and threats that had allowed Blackwood to acquire property after property below market value, always with county approval, always with official sanction for what amounted to legalized theft. "This isn't just about development," Marcus continued. "This is about a systematic campaign to steal generational wealth from working families and transfer it to a man who sees our homes as nothing more than obstacles to his profit margin." Blackwood sat near the back of the room, flanked by lawyers and looking supremely confident despite the accusations flying around him. He'd probably weathered investigations before, Marcus realized. Probably counted on his connections and resources to outlast any challenge, but he'd never faced an opponent who had supernatural backup. As Marcus presented Morrison's recorded evidence of bribery, the lights in the meeting room began to flicker. Not dramatically, just enough to be noticeable, just enough to remind everyone present that some battles were fought on more than one level. Commissioner Vaughn frowned at the ceiling. "Maintenance will need to check the electrical system." "That won't be necessary," Clara said quietly from her seat. "Old buildings sometimes have their own opinions about what happens inside them." The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and several people in the back began pulling on jackets they hadn't needed moments before. Marcus caught Clara's eye and saw her slight smile. The Whitmore family was making their presence known. "These allegations are completely unfounded," Blackwood's lead attorney interjected, rising to his feet. "My client has operated within all legal parameters." His words were cut off by a sound that made everyone in the room freeze, the distinct sound of footsteps walking across the ceiling above them. Slow, deliberate footsteps that moved from one end of the room to the other, then back again. "Is someone upstairs?" Commissioner Vaughn asked. "Building's been locked all day," the security guard replied, his face pale. "No one else has access." The footsteps continued, joined now by what sounded like furniture being moved around, heavy pieces being dragged across the floor with deliberate, measured scrapes that echoed through the meeting room. Blackwood's confident expression began to waver. His lawyers exchanged nervous glances, and Marcus noticed that several of them kept looking toward the exits. "As I was saying," Marcus continued, Raising his voice slightly to be heard over the supernatural commentary, Mr. Blackwood's development. Projects have consistently benefited from county decisions that defy both logic and legal precedent. The sounds from upstairs intensified. Now it sounded like multiple people moving around, rearranging furniture, opening and closing doors. The temperature continued to drop until people's breath was visible in the suddenly frigid air. One of Blackwood's associates stood up abruptly. "I need some air," he muttered, heading for the door. "Mr. Blackwood," Commissioner Vaughn said, her own voice slightly unsteady, "would you like to respond to these allegations?" Blackwood started to rise, but before he could speak, every light in the room went out simultaneously. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting eerie shadows across faces that were growing increasingly alarmed. In the dim emergency lighting, Marcus continued his presentation as if nothing unusual was happening. He detailed the pattern of corruption, the families destroyed, the generations of history erased for the sake of strip malls and chain restaurants. His voice remained steady even as the supernatural activity around them grew more pronounced. Door at the back of the room slammed shut with tremendous force, causing several people to jump. Then another door, and another, until it sounded like an invisible army was marching through the building, slamming every door they encountered. "This is ridiculous," Blackwood finally managed to say, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "These theatrics don't change the fact that—" He was interrupted by a new sound, the distinct crash of glass breaking somewhere upstairs. Then more breaking glass, and what sounded like furniture being overturned with tremendous force. "Security!" Commissioner Vaughn called, but the guard was already on his radio, trying to reach backup units that seemed curiously slow to respond. Marcus looked out at the crowd and realized that most of them weren't afraid. The families who'd been victimized by Blackwood, the neighbors who'd watched their community being destroyed piece by piece. They understood what was happening. The spirits weren't threatening them. The spirits were angry at the right people. "The evidence speaks for itself," Marcus said, placing the final documents on the podium. "Mr. Blackwood has used his influence to corrupt county processes, intimidate families, and steal property through fraudulent means. The question now is whether this community will continue to allow it." A tremendous crash echoed from upstairs, followed by what sounded like windows being thrown open and objects being hurled out of them. Car alarms began going off in the parking lot as debris apparently rained down on vehicles. Blackwood's remaining associates were edging toward the exits, their expensive suits no protection against a supernatural fury that seemed to be growing by the minute. "Mr. Blackwood," Commissioner Vaughn said firmly, "I think you should respond to these allegations." Blackwood stood, but as he opened his mouth to speak, every piece of electronic equipment in the room began malfunctioning simultaneously. Sound system emitted an ear-piercing shriek. Computer screens flickered with static. Even cell phones began buzzing and ringing with phantom calls. Above the electronic chaos, a new sound emerged. Voices. Multiple voices speaking in unison, though the words were indistinct. What was clear, however, was the tone. Pure, concentrated anger directed at the man who'd spent years destroying families and communities for profit. Blackwood's face had gone white. His lawyers were no longer even pretending to pay attention to the proceedings. They were focused entirely on reaching the exits, before whatever was happening upstairs decided to come downstairs. Blackwood began, then stopped as a freezing wind somehow began blowing through the sealed room, scattering papers and extinguishing the emergency lighting in the darkness. Marcus heard Clara's voice, calm and clear. "Some things are more important than money, Mr. Blackwood, and some protections run deeper than what any court can order." The wind died as suddenly as it had begun. The lights came back on. The electronic equipment stopped malfunctioning. Even the sounds from upstairs ceased. Leaving the room in relative quiet, Blackwood stood in the sudden silence, looking around at faces that ranged from satisfied to smugly amused. The supernatural demonstration had made its point more effectively than any legal argument could have. "I withdraw my development proposal," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Commissioner Vaughn leaned forward. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "I said I withdraw my development proposal. For the highway extension, the shopping center, all of it." Blackwood's hands were shaking as he gathered his papers. "And I'm prepared to discuss ... compensation for any families who feel they were treated unfairly in previous transactions." The room erupted in cheers, but Marcus barely heard them. He was looking at Clara, who was smiling with tears running down her cheeks. At Sarah, who was grinning with fierce pride. At the children who would grow up knowing that sometimes, when good people stood together, they could win against impossible odds. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the same pasture where he'd first met Clara, watching cattle graze on grass that was green and thick thanks to the spring rains. The settlement money from Blackwood had allowed them to rebuild the herd, repair the ranch infrastructure, and establish the organic farming operation that was already generating steady income. From the farmer's market, Clara emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, her steps lighter than they'd been when he first met her. The constant worry lines around her eyes had faded, replaced by the kind of contentment that came from knowing your children were safe and your future was secure. "Inspection report came back," she said, handing him a cup. "Morrison passed us with flying colors. Funny how thorough his work is when he's actually trying to do his job honestly." Marcus smiled, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as they watched their cattle enjoying the evening pasture. "Think the ghosts will settle down now that the threat's over?" "Oh, they're not going anywhere," Clara laughed. "But I think they approve of the new management. Last night I could have sworn I heard Jack's father humming while he checked the locks on the barn doors." As if summoned by her words, a gentle breeze stirred the grass around them, carrying the scent of wild flowers and the sound of children's laughter from the house. Somewhere in the distance, Marcus thought he heard approval in the wind, the voices of generations who'd worked this land and loved it, welcoming him home. He bought a cursed ranch for $5 and found a family worth everything. Sometimes, the best investments weren't measured in money, but in the courage to protect what mattered most. And sometimes, when you fought for the right reasons, you discovered you weren't fighting alone. The Whitmore Ranch was home again, protected by love both living and eternal, worked by hands that understood its value couldn't be measured in development potential or profit margins. It was land where children could grow up safe, where families could build futures, and where ghosts could finally rest easy knowing their legacy was in the right hands. Marcus had found his place in the world, and the world had found its way back to the way things were meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.